In 1979, a CIA counterintelligence officer in Langley identified a Soviet mole inside the agency. He was never named publicly. The officer who identified him died before she could testify. She was Irish. Her name was Brigid Malone, and she never told anyone what she knew. Dublin, 1952. A 23-year-old schoolteacher from County Clare applies for a position as a translator at the American Embassy on Elgin Road. Her languages are Irish, English, French, and Russian, the last one learned, she tells the interviewer, from a Jesuit priest who had spent 20 years in Leningrad before the war. The interviewer notes in his report that she is, quote, precise, self-contained, and unusually difficult to read. She gets the job. Her name is Brigid Malone. She is 5'4", red-haired, the daughter of a Galway fisherman and a schoolteacher from Ennis. She has never left Ireland. She has never, as far as anyone can determine, expressed any strong political opinion about anything. Within 6 months, she is no longer a translator. What Brigid Malone becomes instead is considerably harder to describe using official language. The CIA, in the documents that have been partially declassified, refers to her variously as a liaison operative, a domestic intelligence asset, and in one memorable 1961 memo, simply as the woman in room 14. What she actually did was this. Ireland in the 1950s and 1960s was one of the most important neutral territories in the early Cold War. Dublin was a city where Soviet diplomats, American intelligence officers, British MI6 agents, and Irish government officials all moved in overlapping social circles, at embassy parties, at racecourses, at the theater, at mass. In this world, a precise, self-contained, unusually difficult-to-read Irish woman who spoke fluent Russian and had no obvious ideological allegiances was an extraordinarily valuable instrument. For 27 years, Brigid Malone moved through Dublin society. She attended every embassy function. She knew everyone. She remembered everything. And she reported, to someone, what she observed. The question of who she reported to is the first mystery of this story. And it is not as simple as it sounds. The CIA files that reference her are real and partially declassified. They describe her as an asset. They reference payments made to a Dublin account in her name between 1954 and 1972. The KGB files, a small number of which became available after 1991 through the Metrokin archive, also reference her. They use a different name for her. They call her CAILÍN, the Irish word for girl. They describe her as, quote, a source of significant intelligence regarding American diplomatic personnel in Dublin. Both files exist. Both describe the same woman. Both describe her as their asset. Both cannot be right. Or, and this is the possibility that kept 3 generations of counterintelligence analysts awake at night, both can. To understand what made Brigid Malone so valuable and so dangerous, you need to understand what Dublin was in the 1950s and 1960s. Ireland had declared neutrality in the Second World War and maintained it into the Cold War. This made Dublin unique in Western Europe. It was one of the very few European capitals where Soviet and American officials could interact socially without the interaction being formally hostile. The Soviet embassy on Orwell Road was a substantial operation. The Americans on Elgin Road were larger. Between them, in the Georgian townhouses and hotel bars of a small, rainy, deeply Catholic city, the Cold War conducted some of its quietest and most important business. Brigid Malone knew both embassies. She had friends, or what passed for friends in that world, on both sides. She spoke to Soviet cultural attachés in their own language. She attended CIA briefings in a basement on Pembroke Street. She went to the races at Leopardstown with a KGB resident named Volkov, who genuinely believed she was working for him. And she went home every evening to a small flat in Ranelagh, and, as far as her neighbors could tell, lived a life of absolute and unremarkable ordinariness. Her handler, or one of her handlers, was a CIA officer named Thomas Carey, a Boston Irish Catholic who had joined the agency after Korea and been posted to Dublin in 1956. Carey later wrote a memoir, published in 1994, which is one of our primary sources for this story. In the memoir, he describes Malone with a precision that suggests he thought about her for a very long time after she was gone. He writes that she had, quote, the gift of absolute attention. When she spoke to you, you believed you were the only person in the room, the only person whose thoughts interested her. He also writes, and this is the sentence that researchers have focused on, that he was never entirely certain, in 20 years of working with her, whether she was working for him or for herself. That sentence was published in 1994. Brigid Malone died in 1991. She never read it. Or if she did, she said nothing. In 1974, the CIA began a serious internal investigation into the possibility of a Soviet mole inside the agency. This was not in itself unusual. The paranoid years after James Angleton's counterintelligence reign had left the CIA in a state of perpetual internal suspicion. But this particular investigation was different. The trigger was a series of blown operations in Western Europe between 1971 and 1974. Agents compromised. Safe houses identified. One case officer killed in Vienna in circumstances that were officially an accident and unofficially were not. Someone was talking. Someone inside Langley knew the details of operations that only a very small number of people should have known. And that someone had been talking for years. Brigid Malone, by this point, was based in Langley. She had moved there in 1972, officially retired from fieldwork, officially employed as a senior analyst in the European division. She was 43 years old. She had never married. She had no family in America. She had, however, in 20 years of intelligence work in Dublin, accumulated a knowledge of Soviet operational methods, personnel, and tradecraft that very few people in the CIA could match. She knew how the KGB recruited. She knew how they communicated. She knew their patterns. And in 1977, according to a document that was partially declassified in 2003, she told her supervisor that she believed she knew who the mole was. She did not name him in that conversation. The declassified document records only that she requested a meeting with the director of counterintelligence, and that the meeting was granted. What was said in that meeting is not in any declassified record. What we know is this. Brigid Malone submitted a formal written assessment in March 1979. The assessment was classified at the highest level. It was read by 7 people. 6 of those people are identified in the archival record. The 7th is listed only as Senior Officer, European Division, identity withheld at subject's request. 3 weeks after submitting that assessment, Brigid Malone was diagnosed with cancer. She returned to Ireland in June 1979. She died in a nursing home in Galway in February 1991. She was 62 years old. She gave no interviews. She wrote no memoir. She left no papers. The assessment she submitted in March 1979 has never been declassified. It is held at Langley under a classification that, according to the archival catalog, relates to the protection of a named individual. The named individual is not Brigid Malone. The mole she identified, if she identified one, if her assessment was accurate, if the document contains what researchers believe it contains, is still named only in a classified file. And here is what makes this story different from every other mole hunt story you have ever heard. In 1994, a former KGB officer named Anatoly Grishin gave a series of interviews to a French journalist named Claude Berriat. Grishin had served in Dublin in the 1960s. He had known Brigid Malone. He had known her, he said, as CAILÍN. In those interviews, Grishin said something that no one had said publicly before. He said that CAILÍN had not worked for the CIA. He said that CAILÍN had not worked for the KGB. He said that CAILÍN had worked for Ireland. Let me be precise about what this means. Ireland, officially, had no foreign intelligence service during the Cold War. The Garda Síochána had a special branch. Military intelligence, G2, existed but was focused almost entirely on the IRA and domestic security. Ireland did not officially run foreign intelligence operations. Officially. What Grishin claimed was that Brigid Malone had been recruited not by the CIA and not by the KGB, but by a small, entirely deniable unit within Irish military intelligence that had decided, sometime in the early 1950s, that Ireland's neutrality gave it a unique opportunity. If you could place someone in the confidence of both superpowers simultaneously, if you could know what both sides knew, you would have something no other small nation in the world possessed. Perfect information. At zero cost. In a war, you were not fighting. Grishin's claim cannot be verified. He died in 1998. The French journalist Berriat published a book in 1996 that included the interviews, but the book was never translated into English and received almost no attention outside France. The Irish government, when asked about Grishin's claims in a 1997 parliamentary question, responded that it had no record of any intelligence operation of the kind described, and that the question of Brigid Malone's employment history was a matter for the American authorities. The American authorities have not commented. The CIA file on CAILÍN, if such a file exists under that designation, has not been released. What we are left with is this. A woman from County Clare who spent 27 years in the most sensitive intelligence environment in Cold War Europe, who was paid by the CIA, who was documented by the KGB, who submitted an assessment in 1979 that named a Soviet mole inside American intelligence, who then went home to Galway and died without saying a word. Thomas Carey, her CIA handler, visited her in the nursing home in 1990, the year before she died. He describes the visit in his memoir. He sat with her for 2 hours. They talked about Galway. They talked about the races at Leopardstown. They talked about a Russian novel she was reading. He does not record asking her what was in the 1979 assessment. He does not record asking her who the mole was. He does not record asking her who she had really been working for. He writes only, "When I left, she was looking out the window at the rain. I turned back once and she was still looking. She didn't wave." The mole Brigid Malone identified, if her assessment was accurate, was never publicly named. The CIA's internal investigations in the late 1970s and 1980s identified and prosecuted several Soviet assets inside the agency. None of the prosecutions were publicly linked to her assessment. None of the individuals prosecuted matched the profile suggested by the blown operations that triggered the investigation. The operations stopped being blown in 1981, quietly, without explanation. Whatever had been happening between 1971 and 1979 stopped. 1 year after Brigid Malone submitted her assessment. I have thought about her sitting in that nursing home in Galway, looking out at the rain, knowing what she knew, having spent 30 years in a world where information was the only currency that mattered and choosing, in the end, to take the most valuable piece of information she possessed and simply not spend it. Not because she couldn't, because she chose not to. The woman who could read every room she entered and never be read herself, who worked for the CIA and the KGB, believed she worked for them, who may have worked for neither, who submitted one classified document in 1979 and then went home. Thomas Carey ends his chapter about her with a single sentence. It is the most honest sentence in his memoir. I never knew whose side she was on. I am not certain the question applies. The 1979 assessment remains classified. The mole, named or unnamed, caught or uncaught, remains protected by a file in Langley that has not been opened to researchers. Brigid Malone is buried in a churchyard outside Galway City. Her headstone gives her name, her dates, and her occupation. It says, Schoolteacher. If you made it this far, thank you. Subscribe if you're new. There are more stories where this one came from. And if you ever find yourself at an embassy party in a neutral city, speaking to a quiet woman who seems to be giving you her complete attention, consider who else she might be listening for.